I'm a forensic pathologist at Thornfield Memorial Gardens in Millbrook, New Hampshire, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Evangeline Morrison if you want, though most people at the funeral home just called me Dr. Eve during my 17 years there. Ireset sedes internidating. I've examined over 3,000 bodies, determined causes of death in cases that would make your stomach turn, and witnessed every conceivable way a human life can end. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death itself, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Thornfield Memorial Gardens isn't just any funeral home, it's a comprehensive death care facility serving the greater Merrimack Valley, with our main location situated on 47 acres of rolling hills overlooking Lake Winnipesaukee. We handle everything from routine preparations to the most complex forensic cases that require specialized medical expertise. As their chief forensic pathologist, I performed autopsies for 3 counties, determined causes of death for insurance investigations, and prepared detailed medical reports for families, law enforcement, and legal proceedings that could determine the difference between natural death, accident, suicide, or murder. During my nearly 2 decades at Thornfield, I've seen deaths that would haunt most people's dreams. I've examined victims of horrific car accidents, where identifying remains required dental records and DNA analysis. I've autopsied murder victims, whose injuries told stories of violence so brutal that even seasoned detectives would leave the room. I've determined causes of death in cases involving exotic poisons, rare diseases, and circumstances so unusual they ended up in medical textbooks. But I've also been present for the peaceful passings, the elderly who died surrounded by family, their faces serene and bodies showing no signs of struggle, the terminally ill who fought bravely until their final breath, their organs simply too worn to continue. Deaths that, while sad, represented the natural conclusion of a life fully lived. In my profession, you learn to compartmentalize death, to see it as a biological process rather than a terrifying unknown. The case I'm about to tell you about began in late September 2021, though the events that would ultimately bring me face to face with the impossible started much earlier. It began with Dr. Serafina Blackwood, a 29-year-old neurosurgeon at Millbrook General Hospital. Serafina was extraordinary in every sense of the word, brilliant, compassionate, and possessed of a surgical skill that had made her something of a legend in New England medical circles, despite her young age. Millbrook General Hospital is the premier medical facility serving central New Hampshire, a 400-bed teaching hospital affiliated with Dartmouth Medical School that handles the region's most complex cases. The neurosurgery department, where Serafina worked, was particularly renowned for taking on cases that other hospitals wouldn't touch. Brain tumors deemed inoperable, spinal injuries that other surgeons considered hopeless, aneurysms so complex that attempting repair seemed like a death sentence for the patient. Serafina had joined the neurosurgery team at Millbrook General straight out of her residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she had graduated at the top of her class and caught the attention of department heads across the country. She could have gone anywhere, accepted positions at prestigious hospitals in Boston, New York, or Los Angeles. Instead, she chose Millbrook General because, as she told the hiring committee, she wanted to practice medicine where it could make the biggest difference in people's lives. In her 3 years at Millbrook General, Serafina had performed over 800 surgeries with a success rate that defied statistical probability. She had a gift for seeing solutions where others saw impossibility, for finding ways to navigate the most delicate structures of the human brain without causing the devastating damage that could leave patients permanently disabled. Her colleagues called her the miracle worker, though Serafina herself always insisted that her results came from meticulous preparation, exhaustive study of each case, and an unwavering belief that there was always a way to help her patients. But Serafina's excellence came at a personal cost. She worked 18-hour days routinely, often sleeping in the hospital's on-call rooms rather than making the 20-minute drive to her apartment. She had no romantic relationships, few friendships outside of work, and hadn't taken a vacation in over 2 years. Her entire existence revolved around her patients and her operating room, a dedication that her colleagues admired but worried was unsustainable. On September 24, 2021, Serafina had just completed one of the most challenging surgeries of her career. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Chen had been brought to Millbrook General after a bicycle accident that had caused a traumatic brain injury. The injury had created swelling and bleeding in areas of Emma's brain that controlled speech, motor function, and memory. Other hospitals had told Emma's parents that the damage was too extensive, that attempting surgery would likely kill their daughter or leave her in a permanent vegetative state. Serafina had spent 3 days studying Emma's case, consulting with colleagues across the country, and developing a surgical approach that had never been attempted before. The surgery took 14 hours, during which Serafina carefully removed damaged tissue, repaired torn blood vessels, and reconstructed areas of Emma's skull that had been fractured in the accident. When Emma woke up 3 days later and asked for her parents in perfect, clear speech, the entire hospital celebrated what seemed like a medical miracle. It was now 11:30 p.m. on September 27th when Serafina finally left the hospital after spending the day monitoring Emma's recovery and planning for another complex case scheduled for the following week. The autumn evening was unusually warm for New Hampshire in late September, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of the changing season. Serafina lived in a converted farmhouse on Maple Ridge Road, about 12 miles from the hospital through winding country roads that she had driven thousands of times over the past 3 years. It was a route she could navigate in her sleep, past dairy farms and apple orchards, through small communities where everyone knew everyone else, and violent crime was virtually unheard of. What Serafina didn't know was that she was about to encounter Vincent Ashworth, a 43-year-old man whose life had been destroyed by a medical malpractice case 5 years earlier. Vincent's wife, Catherine, had died during what should have been routine surgery at a hospital in Boston. The surgeon, Dr. Richard Hampton, had made a series of errors that resulted in Catherine's death, errors that could have been prevented with more careful attention to pre-operative planning and surgical technique. Vincent had sued Dr. Hampton and the hospital, eventually winning a settlement of $2.3 million, but no amount of money could bring Catherine back or fill the void her death had left in Vincent's life. He had become obsessed with medical malpractice, spending hours every day researching cases, joining online forums where families shared stories of loved ones lost to medical errors, and developing an increasingly paranoid worldview where all doctors were incompetent killers, protected by a system that valued profit over human life. Vincent had been following news coverage of Serafina's successful surgeries, particularly the recent case involving Emma Chen. But where others saw a brilliant surgeon saving lives, Vincent saw another arrogant doctor taking unnecessary risks with patients' lives. In his distorted thinking, Serafina's willingness to attempt surgeries that other doctors considered too dangerous made her exactly the kind of reckless physician who had killed his wife. On that September evening, Vincent was parked on a dirt road that intersected with Maple Ridge Road, waiting in his pickup truck with a rifle he had purchased legally but was planning to use for an illegal purpose. He had been watching Serafina's routine for weeks, learning her schedule and the route she took home from the hospital each night. At approximately 11:45 p.m., as Serafina's car approached the intersection near Thornton Pond, Vincent pulled his truck across the road, blocking her path. When Serafina stopped and got out of her car to see if she could help with what appeared to be a disabled vehicle, Vincent shot her once in the chest with a high-powered rifle from a distance of about 30 feet. The impact of the bullet caused massive internal trauma. Serafina's aorta was severed, her left lung was punctured, and the force of the shot created what medical examiners call a blast injury to her heart and surrounding tissues. She would have lost consciousness within seconds and died within 2 to 3 minutes from catastrophic blood loss. Vincent panicked immediately after shooting Serafina. He had planned the attack for weeks, but had given no thought to what he would do afterward. In his confused and guilt-ridden state, he loaded Serafina's body into the back of his truck and drove to a remote area near Merrimack State Park, where he buried her in a shallow grave and covered the site with fallen logs and brush. For the next 5 days, Serafina was listed as a missing person. Her absence was noticed immediately when she failed to show up for surgery the following morning. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the chief of neurosurgery, knew that Serafina would never miss an operation without calling, and when repeated attempts to reach her went unanswered, she contacted the police. The search for Serafina involved multiple law enforcement agencies, volunteer search teams, and even helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. Her car was found abandoned near Thornton Pond with clear signs of foul play. Blood on the ground beside the vehicle, her purse and cell phone left behind, and tire tracks indicating that another vehicle had been present at the scene. Vincent's guilt and paranoia eventually overwhelmed him. On October 2nd, 5 days after killing Serafina, he walked into the Millbrook Police Department and confessed to the murder. He led investigators to Serafina's body and provided a detailed account of his planning and motivation for the crime. During his confession, Vincent repeatedly expressed regret for his actions, while simultaneously insisting that doctors like Serafina were dangerous to society. This is where I entered Serafina's story. On October 3rd, 2021, her body was brought to Thornfield Memorial Gardens for autopsy and forensic examination. As the chief forensic pathologist for 3 counties, I was responsible for conducting the post-mortem examination that would officially determine the cause of death and provide evidence for the criminal case against Vincent Ashworth. The autopsy revealed exactly what I expected based on the circumstances of Serafina's death. The rifle shot had caused catastrophic internal injuries that would have been immediately fatal. The bullet had entered her chest just below the left collarbone, traveled through her chest cavity, and exited through her back, creating a wound channel that destroyed her heart, major blood vessels, and left lung. There was no possibility that Serafina could have survived such an injury, even if medical help had been available immediately. What struck me most during the examination was how peaceful Serafina looked, despite the violence of her death. Her face showed no signs of struggle or fear, suggesting that she had been taken completely by surprise and had lost consciousness before she could fully comprehend what was happening. In my experience, this was actually a blessing, as she had been spared the terror of knowing she was about to die. After completing the autopsy and filing my official report with the district attorney's office, Serafina's body was prepared for burial according to her family's wishes. Her parents, Dr. Margaret Blackwood and Professor James Blackwood, both academics from Vermont, wanted a simple funeral service, followed by burial in the Thornfield Memorial Gardens Cemetery, which was located on the same property as the funeral home. The preparation process was routine, but carried out with extra care given Serafina's prominence in the medical community and the tragic circumstances of her death. Her body was embalmed, dressed in a simple blue dress her mother had chosen, and placed in an elegant oak casket lined with cream-colored silk. The funeral director, William Crowley, who had worked with me on hundreds of cases over the years, handled every detail with the dignity and respect that Serafina's life and service deserved. The funeral service was held on October 8th in the Memorial Chapel at Thornfield Memorial Gardens. The chapel, which could seat 200 people, was filled to capacity with colleagues from Millbrook General, medical students Serafina had mentored, patients whose lives she had saved, and family members who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. Dr. Patricia Reynolds delivered a eulogy that captured not just Serafina's professional achievements, but her humanity, her dedication to her patients, and the profound loss her death represented to the medical community and to the countless patients she would never have the chance to save. Following the service, Serafina was transported the short distance to the cemetery portion of Thornfield Memorial Gardens for burial. The cemetery, established in 1892, covered 15 acres of gently rolling hills dotted with mature oak and maple trees. Serafina's grave was located in Section J, a newer portion of the cemetery, overlooking a small pond where families often came to reflect and remember their loved ones. I was present for the burial, as I often was for cases I had handled, both to ensure that all protocols were followed correctly and to provide closure for myself after working closely with a case. Serafina's casket was lowered into the ground at 2:15 p.m. on October 8, 2021, in a plot surrounded by family members, close friends, and several colleagues from the hospital who had requested permission to attend the private burial service. After the brief graveside service, the casket was sealed in a concrete burial vault, and the grave was filled according to standard cemetery procedures. A temporary marker was placed while the family's chosen headstone was being prepared. The marker simply read, Dr. Serafina Blackwood, 1992 to 2021, healer and friend. Vincent Ashworth was arrested, tried, and convicted of first-degree murder. During his trial, he showed no remorse for killing Serafina, maintaining that he had been justified in his actions because doctors were a threat to society. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though this outcome provided little comfort to those who had known and worked with Serafina. From a professional standpoint, Serafina's case should have been closed. I had conducted a thorough examination, provided expert testimony during Vincent's trial, and ensured that her family had complete and accurate information about the circumstances of her death. The case file was complete, the criminal was imprisoned, and justice had been served as much as it ever can be in cases involving senseless violence. But 3.5 months later, on January 23, 2022, I received a phone call that would shatter everything I thought I understood about death, consciousness, and the finality of human existence. It was a call that would force me to confront possibilities that medical science insists are impossible, and ultimately lead me to question not just my professional knowledge, but the very nature of what separates the living from the dead. The call came at 11:47 p.m. from Harold Creedman, the night security guard at Thornfield Memorial Gardens. Harold had been working at the cemetery for over 20 years, patrolling the grounds every night to prevent vandalism and ensure that the peaceful dignity of the place was maintained. In all his years on the job, Harold had dealt with every kind of situation you might expect at a cemetery. Teenagers looking for a thrill, vandals attempting to damage headstones, and occasionally, people who came to visit graves at odd hours because grief doesn't follow normal schedules. Dr. Morrison, Harold said, and I could hear the strain in his voice immediately. I need you to come out here right away. There's something happening in Section J that I can't explain. It's the Blackwood grave. The doctor you examined back in October. I've been hearing sounds coming from that area for the past hour, and they're not like anything I've ever heard before. My first assumption was that Harold was hearing the normal settling sounds that can occur around graves, particularly during winter, when freeze-thaw cycles can cause ground movement. These sounds can sometimes be startling, especially in the quiet of a cemetery at night, but they have perfectly rational explanations. What kind of sounds are you hearing, Harold? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. Dr. Morrison, I know how this is going to sound, but I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know what normal cemetery sounds are like. This is different. This sounds like someone knocking. From underground, it's rhythmic, deliberate, like someone is trying to get attention. The hair on my arm stood up as Harold described what he was hearing, but I forced myself to remain rational. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps an animal had burrowed near the grave and was causing sounds that Harold was misinterpreting. Maybe ground settling had created a cavity that was producing echo effects when the wind passed through it. I'll be there in 30 minutes, I told Harold. Don't disturb anything around the grave site, and if the sounds continue, try to time how long they last, and if there are any patterns. As I drove through the dark New Hampshire countryside toward Thornfield Memorial Gardens, I tried to convince myself that we would find a simple, rational explanation for what Harold was hearing. In my 17 years as a forensic pathologist, I had never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by science, medicine, or basic physics. People didn't knock from inside their coffins 3.5 months after burial. It was biologically impossible. But as I pulled into the cemetery parking lot and saw Harold waiting for me with his flashlight, clearly shaken by whatever he had experienced, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. Harold was a steady, reliable man who had worked nights at the cemetery for 2 decades without ever calling me about anything unusual. "It stopped about 10 minutes ago," Harold said as I approached him, "but Dr. Morrison, I've never heard anything like it. It was definitely coming from underground, and it was definitely rhythmic, like someone was tapping out a pattern." We walked together towards Section J, our flashlights cutting through the darkness between the headstones and monuments. The cemetery was absolutely silent, except for our footsteps on the frozen ground and the distant sound of wind through the bare trees. As we approached Seraphina's grave, marked now by the permanent headstone her family had installed, everything seemed completely normal. But then, as we stood beside her grave in the stillness of that January night, we both heard it. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, 3 more knocks, another pause, then 3 final knocks. The sound was unmistakably coming from beneath the ground, from the direction of Seraphina Blackwood's coffin, 6 feet below where we stood. The sound was unmistakable. 3 deliberate knocks from 6 feet underground, directly beneath where Harold and I stood beside Seraphina Blackwood's grave. We looked at each other in the darkness, our flashlight beams trembling slightly as we tried to process what we had just heard. "Did you?" Harold started to whisper. I heard it. I cut him off, my voice barely audible. We stood in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity, waiting. The January wind had died down completely, and the cemetery was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then it happened again. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. This time, there was no denying what we were hearing. The sounds were rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from beneath the ground. In my 17 years as a forensic pathologist, I had examined thousands of bodies and attended hundreds of burials. I knew with absolute certainty that what we were hearing was medically impossible. "Harold," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to call William Crowley immediately. Tell him to get out here with excavation equipment. Now, Dr. Morrison, are you sure about this? It's after midnight, and now Harold, something is very wrong here." As Harold made the call, I knelt beside Seraphina's headstone, pressing my ear to the frozen ground. The knocking had stopped, but I could swear I heard something else, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood. William Crowley, the funeral director, arrived within 40 minutes, with a small excavation crew and portable lighting equipment. His face was grim as he surveyed the situation. In 30 years in the funeral business, William had seen everything, but nothing had prepared him for a midnight exhumation based on reports of knocking from inside a coffin. "Dr. Morrison," William said quietly, "I need to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" Before I could answer, the knocking started again. This time, with the portable lights illuminating the gravesite, we could actually see the ground moving slightly with each knock. Everyone present, William, Harold, and the 3 excavation workers, heard it clearly. "Dear God," William whispered, "how is this possible?" The exhumation took 2 hours. As we dug deeper, the knocking became more frequent and more urgent. By the time we reached the concrete burial vault, the sounds were almost constant, rapid knocking interspersed with what sounded like scratching and impossibly muffled voices. When we finally opened the burial vault and exposed Seraphina's oak casket, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The satin interior lining that should have been perfectly smooth showed clear signs of disturbance. There were scratches in the wood, and the silk padding near the head of the casket was torn and disheveled. With trembling hands, William and I opened the casket completely. Seraphina Blackwood's body had changed position. When we had buried her 3.5 months earlier, she had been lying peacefully on her back, hands folded across her chest, eyes closed. Now her right hand was raised toward the casket lid, her fingers curled as if she had been clawing at the wood. Her head was turned to the side, and her mouth was slightly open. Most shocking of all, her eyes were open, and they were moving. As we stared in horror, Seraphina's eyes tracked toward us. Her mouth moved as if she was trying to speak, but only a faint whispering sound emerged. I leaned closer, and I could swear I heard her say, "Help me." My medical training kicked in despite the impossibility of what I was witnessing. I reached for Seraphina's wrist to check for a pulse, knowing that it was medically impossible but unable to stop myself from following protocol. There was no pulse. Her skin was cold and had the waxy texture typical of embalmed tissue. When I lifted her eyelid to examine her pupils, they were fixed and dilated, classic signs of death, yet her eyes continued to track movement, and her mouth kept forming silent words. "This can't be happening," I whispered. "She's been dead for over 3 months. I performed the autopsy myself. The bullet destroyed her heart and major blood vessels. She died instantly." But as I watched, Seraphina's hand slowly moved toward me, her fingers making grasping motions. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me step backward. "Dr. Morrison," the words were barely audible, but they were unmistakably directed at me. "I can't leave." I immediately called for an ambulance, though I knew no hospital would know how to treat someone who was simultaneously dead and somehow conscious. When the paramedics arrived and saw the situation, they were as baffled as I was. Their equipment showed no vital signs, no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no electrical brain activity. Yet Seraphina was clearly aware and trying to communicate. Over the next several hours, as news of the impossible situation spread, experts from across New England arrived at the cemetery. Neurologists, cardiologists, emergency physicians, and even researchers from Dartmouth Medical School came to witness what was being called the most significant case in the history of medical science. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, Seraphina's former supervisor from Millbrook General, was among the first to arrive. She knelt beside the casket and took Seraphina's hand. "Seraphina, can you hear me? Can you understand what I'm saying?" Seraphina's eyes moved toward Dr. Reynolds, and she seemed to mouth the word yes. "Do you know where you are? Do you remember what happened to you?" This time Seraphina's response was clearer. "Shot by angry man. But I can't go." Dr. Reynolds looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "How is this possible? She's been dead for months." I had no answer. Every medical test confirmed that Seraphina was dead. No heartbeat, no breathing, no brain activity, body temperature matching the ambient air. Yet she was somehow conscious, aware, and able to respond to questions and stimuli. As the night progressed, Seraphina's ability to communicate seemed to strengthen slightly. She was able to provide more detailed responses to questions, though her voice remained barely a whisper, and her movements were slow and deliberate. Most remarkably, she seemed to remember everything: her medical training, her patients, the circumstances of her death, and even some awareness of the time that had passed since her burial. When asked about her experience during the months of apparent unconsciousness, she said only, "Waiting, listening," couldn't respond. The implications were staggering. If Seraphina had been conscious but unable to respond for 3.5 months while buried underground, what kind of psychological trauma had she endured? And if this could happen to her, how many other people might be trapped in similar states of conscious death? By dawn, the cemetery was filled with researchers, journalists, and crowds of people who had heard about the impossible case. Seraphina was carefully transported to Millbrook General Hospital, where teams of specialists began the most complex medical investigation in history. For 3 days, Seraphina remained in this impossible state, medically dead according to every test available, yet clearly conscious and able to communicate. She spoke with researchers about her experience, helped doctors understand what she was feeling, and even assisted in planning research protocols to study her condition. But on the 4th day, As I was sitting beside her hospital bed reviewing test results, Serafina looked directly at me and whispered, "It's time now." "Time for what?" I asked. "Time to go." I
understand now.
Had to say goodbye. Her eyes moved around the room, looking at each person present: Dr. Reynolds, several colleagues from the hospital, her parents who had flown in from Vermont, and me. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she whispered. Then Serafina closed her eyes, and this time she didn't open them again. Whatever force had been keeping her conscious in death had finally released her. The medical community spent months trying to understand what had happened to Serafina Blackwood. Theories ranged from unprecedented neurological phenomena to quantum consciousness effects that couldn't be measured by current technology, but no explanation could account for how someone could be medically dead yet fully conscious for months. The case changed everything I believed about death, consciousness, and what it means to be alive. If Serafina could experience awareness after death, how many other people might be trapped in similar states? How many families had buried loved ones who were somehow still conscious and aware? I couldn't continue practicing forensic pathology with these questions haunting every case I examined. 3 weeks after Serafina's final death, I submitted my resignation from Thornfield Memorial Gardens. The uncertainty was too overwhelming, the implications too disturbing. I moved to a small coastal town in Maine and opened a general practice clinic, focusing on routine medical care far removed from questions of death and consciousness. But I never forgot Serafina Blackwood, or the 3 days when medical science was forced to confront the impossible. Her case remains the most well-documented example of post-mortem consciousness in medical literature. It continues to drive research into the nature of human awareness and has fundamentally changed how many physicians approach end-of-life care. But for me, Serafina's case represents something more profound than a medical anomaly. It serves as a reminder that consciousness, death, and the very nature of human existence contain mysteries that may be beyond our current understanding. The most haunting aspect isn't the medical impossibility of what happened, it's the knowledge that Serafina was aware and waiting for 3.5 months, listening to the world above while trapped in a body that every test said was dead. Her final words to me were, "Some things science can't explain." Yet, she was right. And that's why I could no longer be a forensic pathologist. Because once you've seen the impossible happen, once you've witnessed consciousness persist where it shouldn't exist, you can never again declare with certainty that someone is truly gone. Serafina Blackwood taught me that death might not be the final boundary we thought it was, and that lesson was too profound and too terrifying for me to carry into another autopsy room. Some mysteries are meant to humble us, to remind us how little we really understand about the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Serafina's case was one of those mysteries.